most famous cult leader in American history never actually killed anyone, but Charles Manson convinced a group of young people to commit some of the most brutal murders this country has ever seen. Every major American cult has a playbook, and today we're breaking down all of them, starting with the one that changed everything: the Manson family. In 1967, Charles Manson started building a commune in California. He gathered roughly 25 to 30 followers, mostly young women, runaways, and drifters looking for meaning, and he gave them meaning, just not the kind anyone should want. Manson used LSD, isolation, and pseudo-spiritual teachings to rewire how his followers saw the world. He took the Beatles' song Helter Skelter and twisted it into a prophecy about an apocalyptic race war. The murders were designed to accelerate that war. On August 9th, 1969, his followers broke into the home of actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and killed her along with 4 others. The next night, they killed again. Manson was convicted in 1971 and spent 46 years behind bars. He died in prison in 2017 at age 83, never once having held the knife himself. He built a machine out of broken people and pointed it at strangers. But if Manson's manipulation feels like the ceiling for cult destruction, it's not even close, because one man in Indiana was building something far worse: People's Temple. The Manson family was terrifying, but it was small, a couple of dozen drifters on a ranch. The People's Temple was something far worse. It was organized. Jim Jones founded the group in Indiana in 1955, relocated to California in 1965, and by 1977 had convinced over 1,000 people to follow him to a remote compound in the jungles of Guyana. These weren't fringe outcasts. Many were educated professionals, teachers, nurses, people with careers and families. They surrendered their savings, their property, everything. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. For months before November 18th, 1978, Jones ran what he called White Nights, simulated mass suicide drills. Followers would line up, drink what they were told was poison, and wait to die. Then Jones would reveal it was a test. They had rehearsed their own deaths over and over again, so when the real thing came, most of them had already done it before. On that day, 918 people died, including 304 children. Congressman Leo Ryan was assassinated at a nearby airstrip just hours earlier while trying to investigate the compound. A 45-minute audio recording exists of the final event. You can hear Jones directing people to drink cyanide-laced liquid while screaming fills the background. It was the largest loss of American civilian life in a single event before 9/11, and to this day, people still argue whether it was mass suicide or mass murder, because the evidence of coercion and forced participation is overwhelming. But if the People's Temple showed what happens when a cult builds an institution, the next group proved you could weaponize something even more personal: the Family International. In 1968, David Berg started a Christian commune in Huntington Beach, California called the Children of God. On the surface, it looked like every other free-spirited hippie ministry of the era: young people, communal living, missionary work. By the 1980s, they had over 10,000 members spread across more than 100 countries. But here's where it gets dark. Berg invented something called flirty fishing, where female members were instructed to have sex with outsiders to recruit new followers and raise money. This wasn't some fringe rumor. It was official doctrine practiced from 1974 to 1987. And that's not even the worst part. Berg published explicit internal materials authorizing child sexual abuse and framing it as spiritually beneficial. This wasn't hidden behavior that leadership ignored. It was written policy. When international outrage finally hit in the late 1980s, Berg issued half-hearted condemnations while making sure no perpetrator ever faced prosecution. Berg died in 1994, and most people assume that's where the story ends. It's not. The group rebranded as The Family in the late 1980s, then officially became the Family International in 2004 and kept operating. Fewer members, same organization. Survivors have spent decades writing books and producing documentaries trying to make the public understand one simple fact: this group didn't collapse. It just changed its name twice. But if you think rebranding is a bold survival strategy, wait until you hear about the cult that built an entire city in rural Oregon: Rajneeshpuram. Most cult stories revolve around a charismatic leader pulling all the strings. This one's different. The most dangerous person in Rajneeshpuram wasn't the guru, it was his secretary. In 1981, followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh built a commune on 64,000 acres of rural Oregon land in Wasco County. At its peak, roughly 7,000 people lived there. They had their own airport, their own fire department, their own bus system. It was essentially a small city run by people in red robes who worshipped a man with a a fleet of 93 Rolls Royces. But here's where it gets complicated. Rajneesh himself was largely isolated and heavily medicated for much of the compound's operation. The person actually running everything was Ma Anand Sheela, his personal secretary, and she was operating with almost total autonomy. In 1984, Sheela orchestrated what remains one of the largest bioterrorism attacks in US history. Her followers deliberately contaminated salad bars in the nearby town of The Dalles with salmonella bacteria. 751 people got sick. The goal was to incapacitate local voters before a county election so the Rajneeshis could take political control of the area, a salad bar in rural Oregon, as a weapon of biological warfare. And she wasn't done. Sheela allegedly attempted to poison Rajneesh himself before fleeing the country with $55 million in cash and jewelry. Rajneesh was arrested in 1985 on immigration violations, convicted, and deported to India. Sheela got sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and was released in 1988, 3 years. For the largest bioterrorism attack in the country, the whole thing reads like a political thriller where the villain isn't the dictator, it's the chief of staff. But if you think a poisoned salad bar is the most dramatic standoff between a cult and the federal government, wait until you hear what happened in Waco. Branch Davidians. This is the one where nobody agrees on what happened, and honestly, after looking at all the evidence, you might not either. The Branch Davidians started in 1955 as a splinter group from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. For decades, they were relatively obscure. Then David Koresh took over in 1987 after a violent power struggle with rival leader George Roden and turned the whole thing into something unrecognizable. He convinced his followers he was the final reincarnation of Jesus Christ. He fathered at least 15 children with underage girls inside the compound. And while all of that was happening, the group stockpiled roughly 2.7 million rounds of ammunition and automatic weapons at their property outside Waco, Texas. On February 28, 1993, federal agents moved in. The initial raid went catastrophically wrong. 4 ATF agents and at least 6 Branch Davidians were killed. What followed was a 51-day standoff broadcast live on international television. This was one of the first media sieges in American history. Millions of people watched it unfold in real time. On April 19th, agents used a battering ram and fired tear gas into the compound. A fire broke out. Approximately 76 people died, including 25 children. The exact cause of that fire remains officially disputed to this day. Here's where it gets complicated. Depending on who you ask, the federal government either stopped a dangerous armed extremist who was abusing children, or they burned 25 kids alive on national television. Both positions have documented evidence supporting them. That tension has never been resolved. The siege directly inspired Timothy McVeigh to carry out the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing exactly 2 years later. But if Waco showed what happens when a cult meets the government head on, the next one took the opposite approach entirely. Heaven's Gate. Most cults recruit through charisma, community, or fear. Heaven's Gate recruited through a website. Founded in 1975 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, the group blended Christianity with UFO theology, teaching followers that their physical bodies were just containers and that an extraterrestrial kingdom was waiting for them on the other side. Strange, sure, but for 2 decades they stayed relatively small and relatively quiet. Then the internet changed everything. In 1995, Heaven's Gate became one of the first cults in history to actively use the web for recruitment. They built pages, posted their theology, and reached people who never would have wandered into a commune. This is a genuinely underappreciated detail. Years before anyone was talking about online radicalization, Heaven's Gate was already doing it. On March 26th and 27th, 1997, 39 members died in a staged mass suicide at a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They believed a spacecraft hidden behind Comet Hale-Bopp would carry their souls to another world. Every single person was found wearing black clothing and Nike sneakers. They had ingested phenobarbital mixed with vodka. Each one had a packed bag at their side and a $5 bill and several quarters in their pockets, ready for departure. But here's what makes this one linger. The group left behind video testimonies recorded before the event, and the people on those tapes aren't raving, they're software developers, teachers, calm, articulate, employed adults explaining with total clarity why they're about to catch a spaceship. That footage breaks something in you because it destroys the comfortable idea that only broken or desperate people fall for this. But if Heaven's Gate used ideology to convince people to end their own lives, the next group used chemistry to end the lives of strangers. Aum Shinrikyo. Most people know Aum Shinrikyo as the cult behind the Tokyo subway sarin attack. March 20th, 1995, 5 members released nerve gas across 3 subway lines, killing 13 people and injuring over 6,000. It's one of the worst terrorist attacks in Japanese history, but here's what almost nobody in America knows. They were here too. In the late 1980s, Aum established branches in California, New York, and several other states, recruiting somewhere between 200 and 300 American members. They practiced weapons training, martial arts, and stockpiled materials that had zero business being in anyone's possession. And their main US headquarters? A compound in Queens, New York. Let that sink in. Queens. Not some remote desert compound in the middle of nowhere. Queens. When the FBI finally raided the facility after the Tokyo attack in 1995, they recovered laboratories containing materials for chemical and biological weapon production. These weren't theoretical plans. These were functional labs with components adapted specifically for American targets. A foreign terrorist organization was actively building a domestic chemical warfare operation inside New York City, and nobody caught it until Japan blew the whistle. After the raid, several US members fled to Russia and Japan. Others were convicted on weapons charges, but the bigger question still lingers. How does a bioweapon lab operate undetected in one of the most surveilled cities on Earth? That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a documented intelligence failure that America has quietly pretended never happened. But if a weapons lab in Queens sounds terrifying, wait until you hear about a cult that staged elaborate mass deaths across 3 countries simultaneously. Order of the Solar Temple. This is the entry on this list that nobody knows about, and that's genuinely strange. Because 74 people died, that's almost double Heaven's Gate, and yet most people have never even heard the name. The Order of the Solar Temple was founded in 1984 by Luc Jouret and Joseph de Membro, operating across Quebec and Switzerland. At its peak, around 400 members followed a belief system that blended Catholicism, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and New Age spirituality into something that felt less like a cult and more like a secret society from a thriller novel. Members believed Jouret and de Membro were reincarnations of Jesus Christ and ancient spiritual masters. The goal wasn't salvation in the traditional sense. It was transit, specifically transit to the star Sirius. In October 1994, 53 people died across coordinated events in both Switzerland and Canada. Then more deaths followed in 1995, and again in 1997. These weren't chaotic or improvised. The group left behind elaborate suicide note archives describing carefully staged ceremonial deaths, complete with pyrotechnics designed to destroy the evidence. Internal documents recovered afterward revealed a multi-year planning process. They choreographed their own deaths like rituals. Here's what makes this one genuinely unsettling. Heaven's Gate had 39 deaths and became an instant cultural landmark. The Solar Temple had nearly twice that number and barely registers in popular memory. The difference isn't scale, it's geography. The deaths were split across 3 countries, none of them exclusively American, so no single media cycle owned the story. Sometimes the most disturbing cults aren't the famous ones. They're the ones nobody bothered to remember, but if the Solar Temple feels obscure, the next entry operates on a completely different level of strange, because its leader claimed to be from another planet entirely, Nuwaubian Nation. Dwight York didn't just start one group, he started dozens. Beginning in Brooklyn in 1967, York reinvented his movement over and over, shifting from Black Islamic theology to Egyptology to full-blown extraterrestrial cosmology, changing the organization's name each time. Every version had one constant: York at the center, treated as a divine being. In 1993, he moved his followers to a 476-acre compound in Eatonton, Georgia, and built something genuinely striking. Elaborate Egyptian-themed architecture, pyramids, obelisks, statues. The compound became a regional tourist attraction. The theology taught that black people were the original inhabitants of Earth and outer space, and that aliens would eventually arrive to rescue the chosen. At its peak, the movement had over 2,000 followers. Here's where it gets unbearable. Behind the Egyptian gates, York was systematically abusing children, not for months, for over 20 years. Children at the compound were isolated from outside contact, and the abuse was woven directly into the group's theology. York wasn't just committing crimes in secret, he had built an entire belief system that made questioning him spiritually impossible. In 2004, he was convicted on 10 federal counts of child molestation and transporting minors for sexual purposes. A Georgia grand jury had separately indicted him on 74 state counts. The sentence was 135 years in federal prison. Decades of predation disguised as prophecy. The cultural project York built was real. The community was real. And that's exactly what made the abuse abuse so difficult to see and so devastating to uncover. He used something genuinely meaningful to people as a delivery system for something monstrous. But if the Nuwaubian nation operated in relative obscurity, the next group did the exact opposite. It built an empire in broad daylight. Scientology. Every other group on this list operated from compounds, communes, or the margins of society. Scientology operates from skyscrapers. It has a legal team that has gone to war with the IRS and won. It owns billions of dollars in real estate, and it's officially recognized as a tax-exempt religious organization in the United States. That distinction matters because it means the most institutionally powerful cult in American history doesn't look like a cult at all. L. Ron Hubbard founded the Church of Scientology in December 1953 in Camden, New Jersey, with the first church opening shortly after. Today it claims thousands of organizations and missions worldwide, though independent estimates put active membership somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000. And here's how the money works. Members pay thousands of dollars for auditing sessions, essentially spiritual counseling using a device called an e-meter. To advance through the church's hierarchy of OT levels, you keep paying. The deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. But here's where it gets genuinely bizarre. The church maintains a massive underground vault carved into a mountainside in New Mexico, designed to preserve Hubbard's writings and lectures for future civilizations. Members at the highest levels learned that an alien ruler named Xenu brought billions of beings to Earth 75 million years ago and destroyed them with hydrogen bombs. That's not a joke, that's doctrine. The misconception most people have is that Scientology is a celebrity club. Tom Cruise, John Travolta, the red carpets. But the celebrity tier exists as a recruitment and PR vehicle. The vast majority of members are ordinary people paying extraordinary amounts of money to climb a spiritual ladder. Meanwhile, the church has been investigated by the FBI, the IRS, and multiple international governments for financial fraud and labor violations. High-ranking defectors have testified publicly. The documentary Going Clear pulled the internal structure into the mainstream, and yet it's still operating, still tax-exempt, still growing its real estate portfolio. But if Scientology proved a cult could wear a suit, the next group proved one could hide behind a self-help seminar, NXIVM. This one didn't look like a cult. That's exactly why it worked. In 1998, Keith Raniere launched something called Executive Success Programs out of upstate New York. On paper, it was a self-help company. Personal development seminars, leadership workshops, professional networking, the kind of thing you'd find advertised in a hotel conference room. Courses started at $5,000 and went up from there. Roughly 15,000 people engaged with the organization at some level over its lifetime, and for most of them, it probably felt like an overpriced weekend retreat, nothing more. But inside that sprawling operation, approximately 300 to 400 people formed an inner circle, and within that inner circle existed a subset called DOS, which stood for a Latin phrase roughly translating to master over slave women. Female members of DOS were physically branded with Keith Raniere's initials using a cauterizing pen. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a one-time incident. It was mandatory and systematized. Every woman in DOS knew it was happening because it happened to all of them. Here's where it gets worse. Members were required to hand over collateral before joining, including sexually explicit photos and videos, confessions about family members, anything that could destroy their lives if released. That collateral was the lock on the door. You couldn't leave without losing everything. Actress Allison Mack actively recruited women into this system and helped traffic them into sexual servitude under Raniere. She pleaded guilty in 2019 and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Raniere himself was convicted in 2019 on federal charges including sex trafficking and racketeering. He received 120 years. The most unsettling part isn't the branding, it's that this operated openly in suburban New York for over 2 decades. Neighbors knew the company existed. Local businesses worked with them. Nobody saw it because it looked like a business. But if NXIVM proves that modern cults hide in plain sight, the next group proves they don't always bother hiding at all. The Ant Hill Kids. Every other group on this list had something to hide behind: ideology, theology, a financial empire, a doomsday prophecy. The Ant Hill Kids had none of that. This was a man named Roche Thériault who built a compound in rural Quebec in 1978, gathered roughly 40 people over the years, and tortured them. That's the story. There's no deeper layer. Thériault controlled everything: finances, sexual activity, who could eat, who couldn't, and every medical decision for every person in the compound. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't trained in anything, but he performed surgeries on his own followers, amputations, organ removals, procedures that no human being should ever attempt camped outside of a hospital. In 1988, he cut open the abdomen of a follower named Solange Boilard and removed parts of her intestines. No anesthesia, no sterile environment. She died, and that wasn't an isolated incident. The violence was constant and systematic. Beatings with electrical cables, forced consumption of feces, public sexual humiliation, all of it framed as spiritual purification, all of it carried out in the open for years, while authorities largely looked the other way. At least 12 deaths within the community were never fully investigated. 12. The degree of institutional negligence surrounding this group is one of the most underreported elements of any cult in modern history. Thériault was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He served roughly 18 years before being murdered by a fellow inmate at Dorchester Penitentiary in 2011. Most people have never heard of the Anthill Kids. There's no Netflix documentary that made it mainstream, no celebrity connection, no alien mythology to make it strange enough to go viral. Just a man who tortured people for over a decade while the world didn't pay attention. And that's exactly why it's the last entry on this list. Because when you strip away every layer of abstraction, every charismatic sermon and cosmic promise and financial scheme, this is what a cult really is. Control, violence, and people who needed help that never came. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.